Welcome back to part 6 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Today we're going to be looking at the city versus the open country. Going to try to explain something of life inside the city and out, how conflicts arose between these two groups, and some of the basics of the economy that's found in the city. So, city residents and those in the hinterlands were often in contact with one another, perhaps not those that worked directly in the temple or in the palace, but those that were contracted by the palace or temple organizations, those that traded outside of the city. There was always contact between those inside the city and those in the hinterlands. Often difficult circumstances, particularly economically, would force people out of the city into the countryside. So delinquent debtors, people that were in power that were defeated were often forced to go outside of the city. Also those that defected from the temple or the palace moved out into the countryside. In addition to those moving out of the city, foreigners who came down from the mountains or in from the desert would often join these encampments. Thus, areas outside of the city often became the focal point or the gathering point of disgruntled people or foreigners who had no loyalty to the people inside of the city. When a strong or charismatic leader would emerge from this group, it often led to a revolt, and this revolt would at times lead to the overthrow of the city. We have to then keep in mind that when regimes change due to outside forces, this is not necessarily an invading horde that's coming from afar. It could simply be those dwelling, sometimes for long periods of time, in the hinterlands, waiting for, unconsciously at times, a strong leader to emerge to lead them to overthrow the city. Because of this, kings would work hard to resettle people that had been dispersed, and you see this in royal inscriptions. So given that some economic circumstances would lead people out of the city, let's talk about the basics of the economy in Mesopotamia. So agriculture was the primary basis of Mesopotamian society. To a lesser degree, people would deal in the trade of wool, hair, even though that says hasur, and leather. So you can't get away from textual criticism. It is everywhere, and all of you are experts in it. So they dealt in trade of wool, hair, and leather. And as we mentioned earlier, private households usually did not have sufficient capital. There was not a good cost-benefit analysis that could be done to sustain production in private households. And so the palace and the temple organizations who had sufficient capital and organizational structure and manpower, they were able to farm or be in charge of these large tracts of land or these, dealing in the production of these other goods. So while some smaller plots did exist that could be used by the poor or by shepherds or nomads, most of the land was farmed by the temple and the palace. Now, this was either done by palace and temple workers who were employed by these organizations or by contracted employees. And we'll talk about this in a bit more detail later. And one of the reasons for this, or perhaps the primary reason, was there was significant manpower and organization required to maintain those things that were utilized to do farming, particularly in southern Mesopotamia. So, as we talked about the Euphrates and the salinization that occurred because of the slow-moving water and sitting in basins in the heat, particularly during those summer months when the water would sit and evaporate, you'd get salinization. You'd get silting of canals, which had to be maintained or redug. You had the weakening of dikes, and all of this had to be monitored closely and required great organization and manpower and capital to be able to keep things moving. And so this is why private households, generally speaking, were not able to do this. This was done by the larger organizations. So, in summation, there was often tension between the city and the countryside. Countryside often was made up of disgruntled or foreign people. Strong leaders could lead these people who had no loyalty to those inside of the city. The leaders could foment insurrection and take over that city. The palace and the temple were at the center of the agricultural society in the city. And because of this, it was in the king's best interest to keep stability, equilibrium among the city residents and its hinterlands. Tomorrow, we will take a more detailed look at the Mesopotamian economy. I promise to make it as interesting as humanly possible. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?